One of the most important things to understand about early Christianity is that shift from being a small community around what we might call the Jesus movement to the institution of the church. One of the biggest figures in that transition is Paul. So we talked in class about how that question of whether or not Jesus really intended to create a new religion, or if he was really trying to reform Judaism. So we see that there's a big question about the relationship between what we now call Christianity and what we now call Judaism from that time period that relates to just what would Christians need to be Jewish, who would receive the message, and we see that really a lot of different people became receptive to the very message that that Paul wanted to share. So if you look into the PowerPoint that I posted for the 30th, you can see a map of just Paul's travels all over the Mediterranean. And it's clear that Paul alone was able to travel to many, many different communities all over what we would call maybe the Middle East, the land of Israel, that area, what we would call Turkey today, Greece, as well as Italy. He went to Rome. All of that just in his lifetime. And so, of course, as there are more and more Christian missionaries, this message is traveling all over. But in addition to that early kind of missionary tradition, then we need to see that Christian communities developed that were essentially unregulated, that the church began to develop and create its own institutional networks, including a bishop in each area where there was a Christian community or where missionaries wanted to be there, for there to be a Christian community. So prior to Christianity being linked with the Roman state, it's basically okay for people to develop whatever ideas they want about Christianity. And people are beginning to have very sophisticated theological ideas about the Trinity and about the nature of Jesus. So the study of the nature of Jesus is called Christology, and then, as we've talked about otherwise, the study of the nature of God is called theology. And so for Christianity, Christology is a really particular issue, that Christians themselves did not understand the nature of Jesus and disputed each other, sometimes violently, sometimes just in trying to understand the nature of the person they believed in as God. So the question is, was he really a human, or did it just look like it? If he was human, was he really divine? It has to be that way in terms of how Christianity understands the Trinity, but that's very atypical for how we would think of any creature, that normally the binary is God and humans, right? That part of a definition of one is not being the other. And so for someone to embody that paradox was really a big question. And it's in 313 with the Edict of Milan that Constantine makes a major shift. So Constantine does not make Christianity the official state religion of Rome, but Constantine does say that Christians will no longer be persecuted. Christians will be protected, basically, by the state. So this is a big shift. Constantine goes from being one of a series of emperors who persecuted Christianity, not as severely as Diocletian before him, or as the Diocletian persecution before him, but Constantine makes almost what we would say an overnight shift. He's influenced by his mother, and he's also influenced by politics. Because, as I just mentioned, as the church developed, there's this network of bishops all over. And this really looks like something that's useful to co-opt for a giant empire. that it was an automatic governing network that the Roman Empire could use. Influenced by his mother, he's seeing Christianity as a practice and a set of beliefs that's really important to a lot of different people. But what happens once Constantine makes Christianity protected, and then even more so in 381 when Theodosius makes it the state religion, a later emperor makes it the state religion, what happens once it's connected to the state, once there's a kind of power and authority behind certain claims about protecting Christianity, it doesn't really happen, actually, that Constantine goes from persecuting Christians to persecuting zero Christians. Rather, he goes to protecting some Christians, but persecuting others perhaps more. And that's really what happens as the whole empire develops. Because if the state is going to say, we're going to protect Christians, they have to know how to recognize a Christian when they see one. And they have to decide what is the right way to be a Christian. How can people behave? And when they call themselves Christians, the state will also recognize them as Christians. So very early on, we have the ecumenical council at Nicea that results in that Nicene Creed. The question there is whether Jesus was created in time or if Jesus is eternal. So the ultimate result is that the council decided that Jesus has to be eternal. Why? Because otherwise it would compromise Christianity as a monotheistic tradition. It would compromise the Trinity as really being one. However, the counterpoint was made by a man named Arius, a theologian from Alexandria. And Arius argued the very language of Christianity indicated that Jesus had to be created in time, because there's so much use of language of God as a father and then Jesus as the son. Even if Jesus is this son of man, that this phrase taken from Daniel that's used throughout the New Testament, still there's this language of the son, right? And so what generally happens? Fathers come before sons. However, if Jesus were to be created in time and not eternal, as I said, that would really suggest that Jesus was somehow distinct from God. That if Jesus isn't eternal like God, that seemed to compromise his divinity, and to compromise the unity of the Trinity. The three had to really be one for Christianity to continue to be monotheistic. Okay, so this is certainly an external view of Christianity, that it's not monotheistic, but it's also an extreme anxiety for Christians for hundreds of years as to whether the claims that they're making about Jesus and the Trinity mean that they're not really believing in one God. Okay, so it's decided that Jesus is eternal at that first ecumenical council at Nicea, and then fast forward, your textbook talks about the ecumenical council at Chalcedon. So that one brings up really a different question about Jesus, but it's not to say that the other questions went away or were easily resolved, right? Because the church can say, here's our position, and then say Arian Christians are heretics, right? So it's not that there was an official policy and then these people started believing what they did. It goes the other way, that the church keeps asking questions, and then whatever the church decides against, that becomes heresy, okay? And it's not that easy to tell people, you're a heretic now, you can't do it this way. Particularly when it's about belief, that if it's about practice, you can regulate practice. Belief is in people's heads, right? So the ecumenical council at Chalcedon continues this kind of line of questioning about the relationship of the Trinity and comes to the conclusion that really represents a huge number of Christians then and to today. The general position becomes of the Roman Church, of the Orthodox Church, we can say, which is not to be confused with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which split off. At which point, Roman Christianity can really be called Catholicism. That's not for another 500 years. So Orthodoxy just kind of refers to the early church until 1054. So the decision made at Chalcedon is that Jesus is one person with two natures. So it was a lot of questions. Was he two persons? Was there like the divine version and then the material earthly version? Did it just look like he was human? But the church is really dedicated to saying he was a human in the flesh. The idea of God having become human flesh is really, really important in Christianity. So it has to be that he has at least a earthly nature, a human nature. But because of the claims of the Trinity, there is this claim that he's also divine, right? So some people said, well, he's really two persons, each with its own nature, those kinds of things. But to preserve a sense of Jesus as really an integrated person, which is kind of distinct from human here, it's one person, two natures that becomes the ultimate decision for the Roman Church. There are other traditions that continued that still exist today, and you can look at that too in the PowerPoint that I posted, the numbers today, that there are still Christians who practice some of those ideas. And that's really, again, because of the role of the state, that for the people who lived outside the purview of the Roman state, the decisions at the ecumenical council didn't necessarily compel them to need to at least express a certain belief.